Thank you for joining us on this journey to discover more about the English Riviera UNESCO Global Geopark, one of Earth's extraordinary places. In this series of interviews, our patron, Professor Iain Stewart, explores what it is that makes this geopark so special, from when the rocks around us were formed, to evidence of early humans, and right up to artists and writers who are being inspired by the geopark today.
So welcome everyone to the latest video cast for the English Riviera UNESCO Global Geopark, and a lot of our webcasts so far have been really around the landscape, the rocks of the geopark, but today's one's a little bit different because what we're looking at is the inspiration of the rocks and landscape for cultural outlets of various sorts. And to talk us through those, we've got a mix of cultural artistic backgrounds that are flourishing on the Torbay coast. We've got Chrystine Jones, who's an artist, a Geopark Ambassador Artist. We've got Hugh Nankivell, who's a composer, a songwriter, musical director, something we'll talk about in a minute, which is the Earth Echoes project a few years ago. Adam Neville, who is a novelist, horror novelist, and finds his inspiration in the Torbay. I'll be fascinated about what nooks and crannies he's been looking into. And then we've got Becky Nuthall, another ambassador artist and involved with Torbay Culture. And then finally, Nathalie Palin, who's a creative director for Torbay's Culture. It's a great place. And so I'm going to get to, I think, where this inspiration for you, the different outlets come from. But I'd like to take us back a little bit, particularly for Hugh and Nathalie, to the Earth Echoes project, which was my first kind of experience really with the creative outlet of the geopark. Being a geologist, I think of them in that scientific technical realm, which was fantastic. And Hugh, you were, well, both of you, but Hugh, maybe you could start us off. Tell us a little bit about that Earth Echoes project and the legacy of that.
I mean, I think for me, Iain, what happened really was that about 5 years before then, Mel, I think, accidentally asked a group of artists, non-visual artists, to do a geological project walking around the bay, which we did for a week. And I say non-visual artists because we were storytellers and actors and musicians. And what happened, I think, for Mel in particular, was that she realised that you can express and explore geology through non-visual ways. So most of the geoparks in the world, they have quite a lot of visual artists that represent them. But actually, what about representing the geology through story or through song or through melody or through physical representation? And so we developed that for quite a long time. And then I had the real pleasure of going with Mel to the Geopark conference in Japan and then in Canada. And when we went to Canada, we took some young people with us. And we really kind of shared how we've been looking at how you can make geology into music. And then we were awarded to host the conference in 2016 here in the Bay. And then we spent a whole more than a year working with young people, a kind of story about our geology, our kind of the culture that we have, as well as a whole set of global geological elements that are kind of coming out, like, for instance, the whole thing about the Anthropocene, the kind of geological era we're approaching. And what that meant was that we worked with mainly young people, but actually young people in devising the project, but also quite a lot of older people in terms of the choir and the cast. And we ended up with 100 people taking part in this big project that was, we call it a geological opera, but really it was something, I don't know, it was a symphony. It had 4 movements, it had a brass band, it had members of the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, it had young people, it had old people, it had kind of everything. And was a very extraordinary little moment in time where we were able to represent this space where we live.
Yeah. Nathalie, you're nodding there.
The way the project evolved was these layers of co-producing work with the community composers and Hugh and Mark, and then slowly going on this journey where the physical and script layers developed. And there had been quite a lot of conversations that I'd been having with people about how they understand the geopark. You know, is it something that feels just too epic, too enormous in time and space to be able to understand? And Earth Echoes really kind of brought it back to human beings and the way that, you know, we have layers of experience and how we might. There was quite a lot of making those comparisons between individuals and communities, and then this kind of, you know, immense kind of story and landscape. So it did feel like a really particular journey, and I think it was really, it really galvanized people. You know, the level of closeness in that company was really quite special, and I think that's been a legacy that's really pulled through in terms of the relationship between the geopark and performance-based work and connecting with the community, which like now feels kind of even more, you know, it feels really relevant now.
Yeah, I remember one of those early, I think it was the very first meeting that I went to with Hugh and the team and Mark Neville and Barbican, and they just kind of sucked everything out of my head about geology. So anyone wants the idea of the landscape and the rocks providing this inspiration for this creative output? Who wants to pick up the threads of that?
I think for me it's slightly the reverse, because although I'm an artist and I live on the coast, I think there's always an assumption that we all paint the landscape and we all paint the coast. And I don't paint the landscape and I don't paint the coast. But for me, it's around the place and the environment, and as I was saying before, the cultural heritage and why people settle here. Why do artists like my father, authors like Adam, you know, why do we settle here? What it is about living on this coastline. Mm-hmm. And it's around places and settlements. And because my father was a ceramicist, he was a potter to begin with, he was trained at art school. What brought him here, and then the work that he created and how that was influenced by the coast, and the images he created for the pottery were really influenced by the coast. Mm. We were absolute beach children. We'd spend all our summer on the coast. And so although I don't paint it, it's like in my DNA. I was born in Brixham. I was brought up here. So it's that
strong sense of place that
it's a real strong sense of place. And in terms of geology and Kent's Cavern and Brixham Cavern and why people settled here and the artifacts they make, and then how we evolve, and people like my dad and the artifacts they make. For me, that's the really interesting part of living in a geopark.
It's interesting, we've done some other programs on that human legacy, that early human story, but it's that notion of it from right up to the contemporary with that same human stories. Hugh, I think you were wanting to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about that. I mean, one of the things that I've really discovered through my 10-year exploration with geoparks is, you know, because we're an urban geopark, you know, I have felt utterly overjoyed that I've been locked down in this geopark, because it's really extraordinary to be able to, you know, walk the same kind of 6-mile walk every day for 3 months, which, you know, incorporates, you know, valleys and woods and the sea and the cliffs, and, you know, housing estates and suburbia, and, you know, and so to be able to kind of be within that and to be able to experience it in different ways. So, you know, one morning my partner saw a deer coming behind Pier Point and jumping into the sea and swimming off, you know, which is quite in the middle of town. And then that inspired a whole set of songs that I did with Rick about, you know, well, maybe the rewilding of the landscape did happen. And so we made 12 little pieces about, you know, seeing a humpback whale or a kudu or a whole different set of animals in the bay that kind of take over again, because it did feel as if humans and the relationship with the natural world is so close here that it really felt like it was kind of happening. And so for me, I've really kind of appreciated being in it over the last 4 months.
Adam, I'm interested in your take on this, because you've got a particular genre of writing which doesn't necessarily seem to fit snugly into the particular tourist views of the Torquay area. But tell us what the connection there is.
Well, I mean, before I moved, I've lived here for 6 years, and before I moved here, I lived in big cities, London and Birmingham, for about 14 years. So when I arrived, desperate to get back to the sea, I lived in New Zealand till I was 15. So I lived on a harbour there. The kind of the aesthetic of Torbay was almost overwhelming to start with, and it took a few years for it to properly distill, where I felt I was able to write about it and capture it. And I've had a very kind of visceral, physical relationship with the bay. I've actually swum all of it in stages, and I've kayaked it several times, and I walk it, and then up the tidal estuaries and down into South Ham. So gradually I've absorbed this kind of aesthetic of Torbay and South Devon, and it started to distill into ideas for stories in my imagination. And what I really kind of grasped at, I suppose, and started to refine into a story was this epochal sense. And I mean, even the colours of the sky and the different colours and textures and surface conditions in the sea, remote farms, I just absorbed it all, and it started to suggest ideas for stories. I guess kind of my last book, The Reddening, is a sort of folk and cosmic horror novel. So with horror, for horror to really work and be affecting, it's not just about scaring readers or viewers if it's a film. You want to get something of a sublime, of terror into it. So it's about awe, it's about wonder, it's about fear as well. And it's that very sublime quality that I've kind of extracted from living here and exploring, being in the water and on the water and walking the coast path kind of continually. And it did develop into this story about prehistory, about something super normal being buried, about a kind of a legacy of folklore and folk magic, the pre-Christian and the prehistoric, all of these things I brought into a story. And the day the penny actually dropped and I decided to start writing this book, and it was in late 2017, I went on the tour in Kent's Cabin, which, you know, really is a kind of awe-inspiring environment that you know, you can't really comprehend the age of the earth when you're in a situation like that, and where early modern humans had lived with these when they were fourth in the food chain, behind scimitar cats and giant hyenas and lions and bears, and they all lived in the same caves together. And there was one point where the guide turns the light out, and you're in absolute darkness, sensory deprivation. And at one point they play the sound of an African hyena.
Okay. And
in that cave and in that darkness and that awful kind of bestial sound, this penny just dropped, and I thought, I'm in. I've got my story about an ancient supernormal presence that was worshipped as a god by prehistoric people, and there's some continuity in the locale, in the land, with local people, that's evolved through folklore, etc., to the present day.
It's interesting that, because I mean, for geologists, although we would never admit it, that sense of rocks being a portal back in time is an absolutely visceral part of the training of a geologist. So one of the weird things is if any geologists, almost around the world to be honest, but certainly across Europe, came down to this area, they would kind of see these rocks in the same way. They would be transported back 250 million years to a particular, they'd be able to imagine that environment. And yet the thing that carries them there is the very familiar objects that everyone else would kind of walk past. And so we would never quite get that artistic about it. It would be very kind of technical, but the sense of time, the enormity of time, and the enormity of kind of scale, the changes in the planet. And I guess that's much of the roots of what then seeps into the creative side, that feeling of connecting back to something bigger and longer.
Yeah.
Is that something you recognise in Adam?
Yeah, I mean, it was just, it really opened my imagination, because I'd been in kind of urban environments which lend themselves to the Gothic or contemporary settings, and then to suddenly be here, where you get this very real sense of the age of the earth. I mean, the parts of Torbay were desert south of the equator, and then
it's mad, isn't it?
And then beyond Brixham, it reminds me of Scotland and the South Island of New Zealand, and just within a few miles, you go from the subtropical, where it's very soft and lush. I mean, there's one part I love to kayak from Hope's Nose to Anstey's Cove, and I think you can't see any buildings, and I can almost imagine a kind of prehistoric cry, ringing out from the trees, or you would see some early settlers. There are parts where you can look at the bay and places near it, and I wonder if this is what people were looking at 30,000 years ago. How similar is the topography and the landscape? So there are just those moments where I'm transported, and I can imagine, the earth and the area at a different time, and that's very inspiring for writing stories and
I wanted to go to Chrystine, because Chrystine, your work is very overtly geological, I would say.
It is.
And I get the feeling you had a kind of almost Damascus type conversion to geology, that the scales falling away. Tell us about that and how it's influenced your work.
I think the big thing was being involved with Earth Echoes and making the outfits. So we toured the coastline with a geologist who told us the story and what to look for. And I just found it absolutely fascinating. I had absolutely no idea. And it was just a massive thing for me to learn all this history. And because I've been in education a long time, I've worked at Brixham College and South Devon, I've always had an inbuilt thing that I want to share. Education's a wonderful thing, but you've got to engage, you've got to get people to want to learn. And I think that's what I kind of do with my work. So I work mainly with pewter, and I developed a way of colouring pewter. And a big moment for me was when I actually made a piece that reflected the waves and the movement of the water and the sun and the dappled sunlight on the water. And that was a turning point, because I thought I can really use my artwork to get people interested. And the big thing is they come into my studio at Cockington, and especially foreign visitors, and I just love to tell them things to look for, like the upside down mountain where you can stand on it, and tell them a little bit of the history. And I like to give them some leaflets, some information, so they can actually go off and go and investigate on their own. But my actual work with pictures and jewellery, I try to reflect aspects of the geopark, but it could be all sorts of things. It could be movement, colours, textures, but I think it's more about wanting people to understand how important it is, because to me it's more than just somewhere beautiful to live. It's really, really important, and the history and the stories behind it all. I just want to share that with everyone and get people interested, and that also hopefully gets people wanting to protect the area, which is another thing I'm really passionate about.
It reminds me of the tagline, I think, in Earth Echoes was the rocks connect us, and it was carrying through this from this huge geological timescales of hundreds of millions, of thousands, millions of years, through all the way to, as you were saying, Hugh, the Anthropocene, the human age, the modernity coming in, and the industrial landscape, and then as you've alluded to there, Chrystine, the perils of the modern exploitation of the world, climate change and all the rest of it. And it'd be nice to move on to this contemporary nature of it all and how people are engaging now with people in place. Nathalie, do you want to talk a little bit about there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, really, and you're involved in most of them. So you could probably tell us some of the key ones, and maybe we could draw the people in about how they're engaged in the now, really.
It's quite interesting in around the geoparks. I think there's so much going on, and it's like a rhizome. You don't always know what's kind of developing and sending out shoots in different places. But some of the work that I was involved in last year was we were kind of looking at commissioning artists to work, kind of develop new work that was relevant to Torbay and its communities. And so there were quite a lot of invitations going out for artists to apply to, develop new work. And of all of the invitations, the Geopark was the one that people kept coming back to. And so, yeah, it just really fires people's imagination. And from people who are, who've experienced it in reality, but also who might not be from the local area. And
I just had that thought though, to what extent, because is it just a gimmick in a sense of a way of a twist that it's a geopark and other areas aren't? Or is there something much deeper? I mean, I'm getting the sense that
that's a really good question, actually. I think actually it's funny how people find their way into it. I think for me, I'm really captivated by stories. So whether it's the objects in the Quaternary Cave collections in Torquay Museum, or whether it's finding out about Kent's Cavern, or whether it's specific stories that we discovered through Earth Echoes, those are the ways that my imagination kind of grasps something. And I think for most of the pieces of work that I've got in my mind from last year that are really related, they had that thing, they had something that grabs them. So Sean Harris made this beautiful piece that was kind of trying to bring to life all of the hyenas and scimitar cats and all of the beasts from the case through this kind of like reanimation machine, which was basically stop frame animation with these and we blacked out a church so that kind of you went in and it was experienced in this really particular way. And for him, the stories of what he would call the cave hunters and Pengelly and all of his contemporaries, that's the thing that really captured his imagination. And for him, he's particularly interested in how that story of the ark and all the way through pulls through to where we are now in terms of rising sea levels. And so he's really looking at kind of time in that kind of long way in terms of maybe the way that for us as humans, we're reflecting on, our place in that time. And then something like the Limbic Cinema piece, which were really large scale projections on Rock Walk, which kind of were in 3 chapters, and they were telling this. They were again trying to tell a story of kind of our relationship with our past and what humans might leave in the geology of the future, and which have been quite influenced again through Echoes and them having seen some of the process work from that. And so those stories feel really important. And actually, again, that felt like it was really sitting with the reality of now and climate change and how people are thinking about their custodianship of that in their small way,
There's a kind of parallel going on in the science, actually, because geology as a science for years and decades has always been the inferior science. It's always looked up to physics and chemistry as proper science, where it meant somebody get numbers and all the rest. We would scurry around trying to be proper scientists and things like that and feeling really inferior. And yet, one of the things that differentiates geology is it's a historical science, and the adage is, the Earth is an experiment that was run once and lasted 4.5 billion years, and that notion of big history, as the historians call it, or cosmic histories of we're connected from the present day all the way back to the birth of our sun, essentially, and the birth of the solar system. And that the reason that I thought was interesting is that Geology's done very well on television, and I think it's because it's got that sense of narrative and sense of time to it. Archaeology does, history does very well, archaeology does very well, geology does well, cosmology, you know, that deep, deep time. Whereas straight physics, normal physics, that's not cosmology, and chemistry doesn't. And the thing that's coming through here is narrative, I think, and story, even if it's most explicitly, I guess, with Adam, but I mean, even in the art, it's ways of telling stories. Is that what people feel like is one of the inspirations, the sense of this connection to deeper stories? Hugh?
I think so.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I'm going to go, Chris, I'll bring you in later.
One of the things that really inspired me was the stories. And if you go to Paynton beaches, and you can see from when it was a desert, and you got like pebbles in layers, and the story of how it was a desert, and then flash floods would wash everything away, and then you get these build-up of pebbles. And this is the sort of narrative that you can actually go down to the beaches and see. And for me, that's what it's all about. You can read about things in books, or you can research it on the internet, but when you can actually go and touch it and see it and photograph it, that means a lot more to me, because that's the kind of learner I am. And I think there's a lot of other people who must feel the same way. It's having that personal touch.
Hugh, you were going to come in, I think.
I was just going to say, I've just finished a little project about William Froude, the nautical engineer who did the first ever testing tank experiments in Torquay, just up the road from where I am. And I met one of Chrystine's colleagues at South Devon College, Matt Prowse, who's the head of marine engineering. And what he likes better than anything, and his students struggle with this, is taking them onto the River Dart, where William Froude did some of his experiments. And some of the South Devon colleges looking out over there. And there's nothing he likes better than being in that place. And it's interesting about you were saying about your science, you know, that he needs to be there at it rather than on the computer. And because he lives in this area where he can be, he finds that very extraordinary. And I know that, you know, Dartmouth's not exactly in our geopark, but it is that, you know, that very extraordinary thing about, you know, meeting someone who says, yeah, I'm a marine engineer. What I like to do is be on the water, and where better than here, you know. And so for me, that there is that thing. And just to go back to Adam, you know, you say your story's called The Reddening, Adam?
Yes.
And a red, you know, again, red is so important in this place. You know, we did the first project I think I did with some school kids was called Red Rocks Remain. And then we did another little one was the house that fell into the sea off the red rocks. And then, you know, the red colour. And I think that, you know, some people find that, you know, whether it's red and becomes literature, or whether it's red and becomes music, because usually you'd think it's red and it becomes visual, is a very kind of powerful thing for down here. And I know there are red rocks elsewhere, but it really does feel as if the red rocks here have a kind of story that people are able to tell in lots of different ways.
Yeah, my dad would have used terracotta for his pots and what have you. And what you're saying about the connection, people connecting. I mean, last year I curated an exhibition called Our Place in the Seven Heavens, which was directly about how the moon above the bay and the pull of the tides has shaped our landscape, and for people to think about that in terms of art, but also in poetry. So we asked poets as well to respond to that theme. It was a really good exhibition. It was really, really, really interesting. The artwork, but also the poetry was fantastic that came out of that. And although I say I don't paint the landscape, I do write about it. I do write about it in my poetry, and I write about my experience as a child growing up in this landscape, and what it's like to be a child living on the coast, and having a father as an artist who was himself, he did paint, he was an abstract painter, and he very much, his abstract works are embedded in the coastline and the urban coastline, which is interesting, talking about an urban geopark as well. He very much using the palette of the coastal colours, but bringing them into urban abstract paintings. So yeah, I'm I suppose because I grew up here and I went to school here, and I also work with that quite very vulnerable young people living in the Bay. I'm quite sad about the disconnection young people often have with the coast, even not going to the beach or not going to the moors, and not that lovely connection that we have with the moors and the sea here, how they miss out on that. So I'm sort of slightly on a mission to re-engage young people with their environment, but also to bring people like Nat, you know, in the community into the work that we produce. It's not just about us as artists, is it? Going, it's about bringing people in and saying, please show us your experiences. The exhibition I curated was taken to Torbay Hospital, and it was exhibited at Torbay Hospital, and then the nurses and the doctors there then responded to the pictures, and they wrote poetry about the pictures, and it was amazing. The poems that came out of that, very much about their shift work, what it was like to be traveling home with the moon, and how the moon guided them to work, and how it was there. It was fantastic. It's fantastic.
It's interesting that, and that's what I'd like to kind of lead us on to. I mean, there's a lot of stuff now about the green gym and the blue gym in terms of health and mental health and kind of physical health, and maybe from this conversation it should be the red gym for Torbay. But I'm curious about this business, about what we would like art and the geopark as a mechanism to do in that area. What can art, particularly participatory art, and I know there's a big push in really making the Torbay and the geopark kind of centerpiece of this. What can it do?
It kind of feels like it's I'm not sure that it's what can art do. It feels like we're working, some of the really fantastic conversations that are coming out of the situation we're in now does seem to be about artists are part of the community. They're not kind of like existing alongside like another species.
That's what we scientists think of you. Let's get an artist in for this, you know.
I was going to say I guess connected to that, it's one of the Bay's real assets, and it might sound silly, but I get a real sense here of being on a planet. And you don't often get that in urban environments that have been reskinned with roads and developments and architecture. But there are places around here where you get a real sense that you are on a planet that has had a long story. And I think that offers, it's almost sometimes quite crushing, the sudden sense of insignificance that you get. But at the same time, it can be liberating in that you can escape almost the internal preoccupations of your own mind. Your horizon suddenly broadens and widens, and you're in fresh air. And, a sudden plunge in the sea here can be electroshock therapy, a very positive one. So it's a place that can help people, I think, for absolutely nothing. It doesn't cost anything.
Because I guess I hadn't thought about it before, but I guess it's kind of a non-threatening wilderness. You know, if you go to Dartmoor or these great expanses or something like that, there's something that can feel quite ominous and scary about that. But I guess what you're getting at is there's hints and glimpses of that real wilderness, but in a kind of much more familiar setting. So you kind of think, oh, I'm part of something bigger, but not enough to make you feel isolated.
And I mean, one example I've got is a local teacher who's been teaching the whole time through COVID, when they've had emergency workers, kids there and been school. And she said it's been completely amazing because they've had tiny classes. And the head teacher of this particular school, she said to the teachers, you do what you like. You've got these tiny classes. So they've been following the leads of kids. They've been doing so much stuff outside, and it's quite interesting. It makes me think, about what Chrystine was saying, that her revelation came from being taken to the coast with a geologist and shown what it is. And there is that opportunity, that actually all you need is one of those encounters, don't you? You just need someone to say, let's go for a walk. Oh, look, there's a house that fell into the sea used to be there. that's inspired that person, you know, that they don't ever forget that, you know, or someone else tells them something else. Or as Adam was saying, that kayak, I agree, but I like going to Anstey's Cove because you can't see any other buildings, and yet you've walked from, you know, Kent's Cavern, which is in suburbia, you know, 10 minutes earlier. It's that kind of fantastic space. But you need to be taken there by someone who's got, you know, whether it's an artist's eye or geologist's eye, to be able to kind of encourage them into that space.
Connected to what Hugh just said, I mean, it was joining the local canoe club that really opened my eyes. There's a stretch in Brixham from Elbury Cove, kind of going round to Churston Cove and Fishcombe, where you have a series of rewilded quarries where they quarried limestone, I guess in the 1800s, but they've rewilded now. If you see them from the sea, particularly towards high tide, you're almost level with the base of them. I mean, they look like ancient ruins from Aztec or the Incas or the Mayas or something. And again, there is no development. There are no buildings in sight, and it's this. I always get this kind of feeling of awe. It's like it's part fear and it's part wonder. This incredible kind of natural rewilding of, I guess, industrial archaeology. So it's part of that story, part of that human story that's been continuing for a few thousand years, but it's just an absolute drop in the ocean compared to what continued.
The way I connected with as a child, one of the ways I connected, our school was made out of red and sandstone bricks, and I remember running my fingers along it and finding fossils. Now I went to a convent and I wasn't even meant fossils didn't really come in.
They don't exist.
Come into it. Well, in 7 days, how did we get the fossils? But that's how my curiosity was really sparked by that, and drawing ordnance survey maps. We used to have to do that in school, the topographic bits and what have you. And that was very local. We had to do that, looking at local maps. And I looked back recently at some really old maps, and I did write a poem about it because it just brought me back to that, to being a school girl, and that how they were educating you in this big way, but actually it came back to the local. And there's wonderful old names that looked on the maps, Woodhewish and Boohay. Fantastic. There's old settlements.
We've been spent most of our time looking back as a geologist. That doesn't, that's not a surprise. But what about looking forward? Where do you see this juxtaposition of art and geology, and particularly I'm thinking around the participatory work, because I know that's it. Where do you see this going, over the months and kind of years ahead within the Torbay? What can people look forward to? Nathalie, thanks.
I feel like Torbay's relationship with participatory practice is really quite special. There's so many people making really quite incredible work co-produced with communities, and that's kind of something that we've really become really rooted in. And again, in relation to performance-based work and looking in relation to the environment and our communities, that also feels like something that we really kind of are striving ahead to kind of make those connections between community and place. And with everything happening around COVID-19, it does feel like the communities are looking to outside, and how that sense of awe can help us, that sense of how do you belong in a place, and how do you kind of feel gratitude for your place and where you are. And equally, with quite a lot of participatory and performing arts, we're going to be in this kind of odd space where we are going to need to think about our outdoors. And there's been some interesting conversations happening around how do we reclaim the village, the natural amphitheatre as a performance space, the village green, because actually all of the kind of elements of our system need to be thinking about kind of working together probably, and actually the landscape and the natural environment feels like a place where they all connect. Yeah, it does feel like it's going to kind of, notwithstanding all the challenges, and that I think Torbay's communities are going to face some real challenges, as many people are. But it does feel like there's a crack here. There's an opportunity to really think imaginatively and have to and that might be imaginatively, creatively. It might be applied to any number of situations. So I kind of feel that there's real opportunities to be connecting our natural environment with creative practice, with people who are working in the arts professionally, people who are just finding their way in, and hopefully responding to the incredible environment, but also using the environment as part of what we need, a solution, a conversation with it more.
I run a monthly poetry night in Torquay, which obviously went completely in March, as all events like that did. But I've started having conversations again with other poets about how we perform our work again, and talking about performing it outside. Although there was a lot of conversations about the seagulls drowning us out and general noise that you get on the coast. But we are starting to have those conversations again. We need to get back out there performing our work. It's always been in closed spaces, and that's not going to happen for a while in the very closed spaces that I perform in.
Adam, I was just curious. Writing is quite a solitary process, I suspect, and maybe horror writing even more solitary than most. But for you, that perspective, kind of looking forward.
Yeah, I mean, I will continue to be kind of inspired, and stories will come from just living here and exploring. But I mean, one thing that has really surprised me since I've lived here is, I mean, it's not just the natural beauty you have here, and such variety. I mean, the woods, the beaches, the coves, the sea, and also the colour of the sea. Sometimes you could be in Greek islands or something, and at other times it can look like a naval battle from the Second World War. It looks like metal. But is how few people know about Torbay outside of the area. I mean, I always feel like I'm walking on a film set if I go to, Oldway, or I glide past the quarries in Brixham, or I'm exploring some caves or scrambling over something. I mean, just the amount of assets that the area has. And yet, I didn't know anyone down here really. But when people visit me, and they see my photographs in social media and so forth, they always say, "Where's that? Is that in England?" And I've taken people on walks. They're just astonished that they're even in the British Isles. So that filmic, almost cinematic quality that the area has, if that could somehow be projected as habits are changing now, how many airlines will survive? Will people still be going on holiday abroad? If people are going to have to look domestically for places to visit and have holidays, I can't think of many places better than Torbay or South Devon. And it's so easy to get to as well. But train links, motorway links, North Devon, spectacular, but it's harder. The efforts people go to Cornwall and sit in traffic jams, they glide past Torbay and they'll say to me, "Oh, I've seen Torbay on a road sign, but I've never actually visited." So I don't know, collectively, film, music, sculpture, art, perhaps we kind of boost the signal and make it resonate more.
That's a great place to finish, because we're on the hour really, but also because of the notion of boosting the signal. I mean, in many respects, if there's one thing the UNESCO brand does, is it attempts to boost the signal. And I guess the whole point of the Geopark is that idea of this USP, that we can help to do that. So I'd like to thank everyone for leading us through that. It's been fascinating. So Chrystine, Hugh, Adam, Becky and Nathalie, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
The ritual magic of drawing ordnance survey contours. Bounce of black ink caught in the nib, small vibration of a scratch shakes it down, around, parallel lines and tracks, making maps like ritual magic. The lanes and old names conjured back, the contours of a farm hill spreads like a rippled cowpat to the water's edge. The lines drawn in black ink transcribes ancient topography, topsoil, worn ancient stones, ritual magic lain in hexagrams. Signs pointing to a colony, Boohay, Hoodown, Wood Hewish, the excavated copper-plated old names, some written out to sea, flung from the flicked nib, the bounce rebounding on the coastal boundaries. A contour is only seen from above to illustrate the undulating hills flat, not what stands straight like travellers, livestock or pilgrims. So I catch them back, scratch back their likeness with symbols between the black parallel lines during the ritual magic of drawing ordnance survey contours on maps.